Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the summit. I'm your co-host, Dr. Mike Sapiro, clinical psychologist and ordained Zen monk. And I'm very pleased to be here with Rhonda V. McGee. She is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco and a leading mindfulness teacher and practice innovator with a focus on applying mindfulness to the hardest challenges of our times. She is an internationally recognized teacher, guide, and mentor focused on integrating mindfulness into higher education, law, and social change work. A prolific author, Rhonda was named one of Mindful Magazine's inaugural 12 Powerful Women of the Mindfulness Movement in 2019. Her book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness, was recognized by the Greater Good Science Center in Psychology Today. Rhonda, thank you so much for coming on Summit.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I would like to start off, as I do with most of our guests, with asking you, what is most alive for you today with what you're teaching?
Thank you so much. Well, I happen to have recently started a community of practice, really a place where people who have been joining me for various teachings over the years can join on a regular basis. So it's a meeting on Sunday. And I've been using different themes to help guide us for segments of the time. And the current theme is focusing on the teachings of a reverend doctor whose name many people don't know, but I think everybody actually maybe should know a little bit more about. And her name is Pauli Murray. And so what's alive in me is the inspiration that Pauli, who was a law professor who became a priest in the Episcopal tradition, religious tradition, I'm really present to the way her lifelong commitment to teaching and learning and practicing led her to a deep understanding that behind all of our efforts to make the world a better place is really kind of a spiritual invitation to find a way, right, to make it safe for us all to kind of love and be loved no matter who we are, where we are. This sort of universal human rights message of love is what's really alive in my teaching right now.
I know for you and with your book and also what you've taught is a sense of using mindfulness for a sense of belonging. And I know, and inclusion, but I know there's so many people, maybe many people listening who do feel maybe excluded, don't feel safe to join in communities or spiritual groups. So what could you do to help us move toward that sense of belonging and inclusion?
Well, I think I appreciate what you're asking here because there's a certain poignancy to it. It resonates deeply with me, this sense that a lot of us are feeling a little disconnected, feeling a heightened sense of kind of alienation and a sense of a lack of belonging in many places, or at least uncertain as to whether or not we can feel socially and psychologically safe in many different settings. For me, practicing, what I call mindfulness, it's obviously, for me anyway, a way of bringing forth traditions that have a lot of roots, but certainly roots in Buddhism for me are really strong. Bringing that forward and really exploring what that means for me personally and as I move into the world has really been about, in a certain sense, cultivating a sense of inherent belonging that supports me in just kind of moving through the world. And so I would offer that these practices of mindfulness may actually, we see them as personal practices. We see them as something that we do kind of on our own, away from the crowds. To me, as we deeply practice in ways that connect us to our inner lives and to a sense that we really are fundamentally already at home in these bodies, in the world, from that place, we can move into really more and more spaces with this sense of already connectedness, that can lead to a kind of, well, many different manifestations in our interactions. I'm thinking particularly of metta and loving kindness as one of the bridges from the personal practices that cultivate a kind of a quality or state of mindfulness to how it is that that can be alive in our interactions through friendliness, through loving kindness. And all of that to me supports, feeds back in a way the sense that I already, always belong.
How does mindfulness help people feel at home in themselves? This summit's really about making this year
Yeah.
the best of our lives. And this is what we have. We have this year, we have today, right as you were listening, right as we're talking, to feel home within ourselves, which would be
Yeah.
the best refuge we could ever have if we touch it.
So true.
How do you lead people there?
Yeah, I think that for me, I'm aware of how it is that the early teachings of the Buddha, right? The teachings that underlie what we call mindfulness in the world, highlight basic practices um, that have for millennia, as I understand it, supported us in feeling at home in our bodies. And so, um, experimenting with establishing a regular practice of mindfulness meditation, and really exploring deepening a meditation practice, to me can really be one of the ways that we arrive at a sense of being at home in our bodies. And I recognize that meditation may not be for everyone, but the particular way that I approach it these days, is to focus on uh, two aspects of the teachings of the Buddha. One, the establishments of mindfulness. So opening the door to what some people call the four foundations of mindfulness or the establishments of mindfulness, which invite, really resting in a sense of awareness of the body as a foundation for all of the practices that we call mindfulness. So, uh, establishing mindfulness of the body, and as a part of that or from that, you might say, uh, sort of becoming more aware of this body and its feeling tones, right? And from that place, becoming aware of the body, feeling tones, and what we call the mind. And through all of that, simply becoming more able to see some of the deeper teachings of the Buddha that we call the Dharma, in our living experience. These four foundations of mindfulness, to me, are a beautiful set of teachings for allowing us to just come right home. They really do begin for me with um, coming home to the felt sense of the body breathing and sitting and feeling points of contact between the body, uh, and what we call the environment and the place that we're in. So the body and points of contact with the chair that we're in or the cushion that we're sitting on, and from that place the ground below, and the breath, the air that is flowing in and out that we call the environment outside. And of course it invites us to become more clear about the fact that we are always already a part of this so-called environment that we often think of as somehow external to ourselves. So right there, from resting in awareness of the body breathing, to me, that is a fundamental, simple, portable practice for reconnecting with this changing body, in relationship always already to a world in which, I, in some sense, um, fundamentally experienced, existing, and without which I don't exist, right? This breath, all the elements, the water, the sun, the temperature just right for this body to continue to survive. all of these ways of remembering fundamentally what it means to be alive in these bodies, and that it is an always dynamic, changing experience. These to me are the foundations of mindfulness practice. And so establishing mindfulness in those ways, and then deepening it with a practice called mindfulness of breathing, which really is another one of the core practices that the Buddha taught, which helps us to really cultivate more deeply the kind of nourishing possibilities of a simple conscious breath. The way that we can more clearly arrive at a sense of calm, ease, and even joy that can accompany us even as we experience all of the impermanence, all of the change, all of the, sort of conceptual clarification that sometimes is not easy, right? For us to go from like feeling something is real and fixed to actually, oh, it's changing. Actually, no, it isn't what I thought it was. Mindfulness in these ways can help us apprehend all of those things more clearly and just be at home in the midst of all of that. And to me, this is why it's really the foundational practice for well-being for myself and for those that I work with at this time.
As we're talking about belonging, one of the things I notice with my clients, and all of them are prescribed meditation or mindfulness in some form or another, is that they start to really notice how exclusionary they are with themselves. They don't often like themselves. They don't like their bodies. They hear the critic come in, or the self-hater, or they notice how much shame they have for themselves. And so meditation or even mindfulness, just simple act of focusing on the body, becomes almost a struggle in looking at how they see themselves, which is often negative. And so it's hard to belong in a world where we don't really feel like we belong, even in our own skin. So how do you teach and how do you guide people through that kind of revelatory experience where they're like, I don't even like myself?
Yeah. To me, this is why in my humble way of approaching all of this, there's this additional piece that I didn't mention before. Well, a couple things are coming to mind. One, the 7 awakening factors, right? Which, include mindfulness, investigation, energy, joy, um, tranquility, concentration, and equipoise. And the joy part. So there is a way that when I think of, again, these expanded teachings of the Buddha, um, joy, ease, metta, right? So the other, in addition to the awakening factors, the Brahma Viharas, right? So loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. I'm pointing to the kind of broader set of teachings that to me always are with what we call mindfulness. I think where we get in trouble is when we sometimes, in service of seeking to teach something concrete and accessible and clearly, right, we can extract a piece of it. So we're going to teach mindfulness and we're going to focus on that. And you can't teach a world-sized map of the world if we're just trying to teach this one thing. So I understand the wisdom of that as a teacher for many years myself, and in many different traditions, and including in law. So I know what the challenge is to kind of pull out a particular objective and focus on it. But I do think that there is a downside to doing that too much with mindfulness. In other words, when we focus too narrowly on the practices of becoming aware of the breath in and out and the body without including some of the fundamental ways that it seems to me the teachings underlying mindfulness are if you will. There's a sort of, to use Thich Nhat Hanh language, there's an interbeing, if you will, between the awareness practices of mindfulness and compassion for oneself, and this quality of metta, you know. So to me, it's important to really support, especially beginning meditators, and especially in the Western or the many different kind of contexts that we find folks coming to these practices at this time in the 21st century, given everything that's happening in the world. It seems particularly important to kind of not miss that sort of almost what feels like a kind of a underlying water, if you will, like to moisten these practices. It's like it is like that compassionate heart. In fact, I'm not a person who is familiar with Pali or Sanskrit or these, original languages in which these teachings were found, but those who are have shared with us that part of what we're talking about is maybe some way in which some qualitative dimensions of mindfulness have been a little bit lost in translations. To use the word mindfulness, as I understand it, for example, is itself a choice that's been made culturally. We could instead have taken the very same signs and symbols and translated them into heartfulness. And if we had done just that, I think it would go a long way in disrupting some of the ways that we tend to teach mindfulness in this more arid cognitive way, in a way that leaves aside somehow the heartful kind of, juiciness that I'm pointing to. So, yeah, I think it's really the challenge that you're pointing to. It feels like it's a part of this larger challenge of like situating mindfulness in more of some of the sort of ineffable, some of the sort of aspects of the practices that have been a little bit left out of the context as we have translated these practices into teachings for the Western and, Americanized and these sort of Europeanized, these audiences. Because from what I understand, the original teachings and in more of their original cultural contexts, there was just a much more of an understanding of a person in connection in the world, first of all, not an isolated individual, and also a lot more of this quality of heart, this quality of basic goodness, if you will, that is embedded in the teaching of mindfulness that can get lost in the West.
Yeah, and I think if our intention is to connect here and then connect outward, we have to have the basic premise that we're innately good and so are others. Even if when they're causing harm, there's still innate good inside of them. That's a hard one for people to pick up. It's like, well, this is supposed to make me, feel better about those who have hurt me. I'm like, actually, it does in essence, which is taking some of the toxicity out of ourselves when we start doing some of that inner forgiveness and outer forgiveness.
Yeah.
So, I think what you're teaching and where you're going is that the inner connection then helps us make outer connections. And that's what we're longing for in an age where we're so divided and divisive. We're longing for deep connections. And so how does going from sitting on our cushion and doing mindfulness of body, mindfulness of breath, translate to then translate to connection, interconnection, interdependence with others, and forming communities?
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways, maybe some of what I've said before will allow me to I'll elaborate on some of what I've said before as I answer this piece. Again, for me, mindfulness is about coming home to a reality that's often been sort of hidden or occluded in our contemporary way of seeing the world. The sort of received ways we have of moving through the world, a sense of ourselves as separate with our own, little, personality, background, resumes, projects, all the things that to move through in conventional contemporary culture are, pretty important. A certain kind of sense of an ego that matters, that moves through the world. mindfulness practice is inviting us a kind of waking up to some of the ways that that conventional way of being misperceives the full reality of who we are, or dimensions of who we are, that sort of reductionistic picture leaves aside. And so just by simply breathing and becoming more aware of the reality that as we breathe in and out, we're breathing air, we're taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. In other words, that simple process is, to me, an opportunity, an invitation to begin to have a sort of an insight into the some of what I'm pointing to here, some of what is sort of forgotten, occluded, hidden in our everyday movements of the world, that is actually always here and is always true. So as we breathe in and out, we're able to kind of see more clearly that radical interconnectedness and interdependence between this body and what we call the environment outside of ourselves. From that place, we can begin to be curious about the many different ways that as we move through the world, in these so-called separate bodies, we're actually interrelating with other human beings all the time. And so mindfulness certainly can, both the internal practices of becoming more aware of, this body, it's felt inner sensations, feeling tones, thoughts, all of those things. We can also cultivate the external dimensions of mindfulness, the awareness of those who are around us, the changing facial expressions on a person that we're having a conversation with, the tones being conveyed underneath the words that someone is conveying, that are also always a part of any human communication if we're open to noticing more of what there is in that interaction. These are just some of the ways, right? Just opening up a little bit more of our capacities to perceive, to be present, to notice, that can then help make us more effective listeners to other human beings in our interactions. All of this then can help open the ability that we all always have to have a richer, deeper, more meaningful and effective connection with another human being when we meet them. I often have had the experience over the years of introducing my students to ways of having mindful pair and share short reflective connections with one another. It can be in a law school class, at a retreat center, but really invariably, when given these short formula for listening and speaking in these mindful ways, my students or participants will come away with this feeling that this is the perfect person. They had so much in common with this person. Dare say it, they feel like they love this person, after 5-7 minutes of this kind of mindful communication. So that's just one example of the actual power of attending, because in fact, so many of us are feeling bereft of really being listened to, of being able to listen to people well. We got these devices that are constantly distracting us and feeling like we're supposed to be multitasking all the time. We need actually ways of being together that themselves, in these very simple, freely available ways, can help repair that sense of disconnection that we feel within ourselves and that can happen and arise in our relationships. Mm-hmm. And that is a pathway to this broader capacity for mindfulness to support us in expanding the sense of community and expanding the sense of inclusion. And the only other thing I'd add to that is it helps, I think, to remember the ethical underpinnings of mindfulness. That, the traditional communities within which these practices were taught often arose within and in the midst of commitments to ways of being together in community that would support the practices. Again, one of the things that I think we are suffering from as we seek to apply and experience mindfulness more fully in the world today is this disconnection from some of the earlier traditions and the roots of the practices that have, again, traditionally helped them flower. So having mindfulness arise not only as one's personal practice tied to an app somewhere, maybe with one other teacher every once in a while, but instead as part of a community, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the practices in what traditionally, for example, would be called a sangha or a community of practice. This was very important, has been important for millennia. And we've somehow disconnected the practice from the embeddedness in community, which has, had as a consequence this struggle we have to sort of see the relationship between the practices and making our way in relationships with each other and deepening and enriching community. Traditionally, they were always embedded in those kinds of communities. And as a part of that, these invitations to see the importance of, or even to embed the practices at the foundation in, commitments to ethical ways of being with each other. So minimizing harm, right? First approximation of an ethical commitment to travel with our mindfulness practices. We seek to do no harm as best we can, or to minimize the harm that we might do as we move through the world, in recognition of the fact that our actions matter. And from that place, very simple ways of just allowing our mindfulness to be infused with this commitment to being aware of our actions in the world and how they impact others. And so for me, all of these interrelate, right? This is how mindfulness actually helps us with building community, building a sense of more inclusivity, as a value and as a practice that supports our waking up in the world.
I very much appreciate you bringing ethics in. I've been practicing for about 30 years now, and I'm embarrassed to say that for most of the time, I think I was focusing on certain states of mind or experiences with my practice, or achieving certain things experientially. And it was later in my life where I realized that a spiritual life is an ethical life. And the mistakes I have made over my life could have been mitigated or lessened had I really understood that a spiritual life is based in ethics toward ourselves, the planet, and other people. I'm so glad at least I woke up as much as I have now to see that. And now move forward. I even carry my precepts in my wallet with me to remind me of the importance of taking care of my body, mind, soul, and others, and the planet and animals. I don't think you can pull those things apart anymore.
Exactly. And how that ever happened is, to me, just a curiosity. But
how did
we
lose
got them disconnected?
Yeah.
And yet, this is not a criticism of you. What I mean to say is, I experience the teachings of mindfulness in this way of sort of somehow mostly separate from ethics, as I received them as a student as well. And it's, been part of my own journey over the years to kind of go back to the original sources and see how clearly ethics have always been, intended to be at the foundation. And so that's just another way in which we as individuals, but really those of us who are privileged to support others, to co-journey with others as spiritual directors, as guides, as teachers, if you will, facilitators, we actually, I think, have a kind of a responsibility to help repair that breach as well.
I don't think that separate. A spiritual life, I think, includes repairing.
Yes.
It includes doing the work within ourselves and with others, and helping others make those repairs too. I mean, there's a lot of cracks between people and nations and ethnicities and education levels. There's all these cracks, but what I love
Yeah.
with the idea of kintsugi, which is putting the gold flakes between the cracks, and all of a sudden this pottery that's damaged now has beauty to it. So we use what is broken to build something beautiful and repair. And
Exactly. And letting the lights coming in through the cracks is another kind of
yeah,
metaphorical teaching around that. And certainly for me, as I start my book out, one of the quotes that I use is the front of the book that guides a lot of the effort that I made and at least this work, yes, the inner work of racial justice. But as you pointed to, that's been a theme of my practice and my work to create more of a sense of understanding of how these practices help us heal, including these ways that we're divided socially through identities and notions of difference and all the conflicts that historically have arisen and show up even today. And so healing the separations, healing those fractures to me really is another way of thinking about what these practices, what a spiritual life is about.
this must come from your personal experience. This is not something you read about and then write about. This is something you've done, right?
Yes, for sure.
Could you,
Yeah.
yeah, could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I grew up, and I'll just briefly say that growing up in this body, for those who are not able to have the full visual representation here, but brown bodied, cisgender female in the United States of America, right? Racialized as a Black woman. And I was born in the part of the US that's associated with the South, right? So the state of North Carolina. Um, I had a lot of experience with some of the legacies of the hierarchies of othering and really systemic oppression, frankly, that racism and patriarchy and all of the different painful social sort of dynamics that we have come to understand have been features of the histories of certain aspects of the United States of America, and different versions of this show up in different places around the world. So that, growing up as a Black woman in the South, I came to know a lot about the different laws and policies and social practices that had historically made it difficult for a person like me to really feel safe, to feel a sense of belonging or mattering, you know. And at the same time, I grew up with a grandmother who had been called, frankly, to the Christian ministry and who had a regular daily practice. For her, it was like a centering prayer practice, but she would get up in a very disciplined way every day and center herself on her own values, a sense of her own mattering, and the teaching possibility that any day might present, the sort of responsibility in a way that we all have to like make the most of the life that we have. So I think it was a combination of having sort of ready everyday historical references and teachings, but also experiences in my own life of discrimination and vulnerability that come from the legacies and habits and patterns and social dynamics of racism and sexism and all of those things. I had those experiences of racial slurs and physical vulnerability of as a woman moving through the world that made real for me what we're up against, what human beings can suffer and what we can do to each other to hurt each other. And some part of me just knew that part of my mission on the planet was to help heal. I'm not sure where that actual knowledge comes from, be honest with you, because I feel like as a small child, I had a sense that there was something more to being alive than the kind of way things were organized around me. I just had a sense that there was something that we somehow lost touch with. And
Yeah.
I was kind of almost in a way that made me vulnerable to some teasing, a kind of compassionate kid, like an empathic kid. So I could always feel the pain of other kids around me. So I don't know exactly where it all comes from, but I do know that my meditation practices and the mindfulness practices that I became aware of became a home for me, a place where I could feel at ease with these ways of seeing the world and with this sense of a purpose that could draw on those experiences, but draw on them as support and energy for seeking to make the most and to support others. I drew on them as a source of compassion and empathy for others who would be suffering.
Mhm.
And that really has fueled my work over the years.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing that, and it's your real life experience that is necessary for us to hear and witness and bear witness to. So it's not just a concept. It's like, oh, this, it's real. Oppression and suffering is real. And we start from there rather than denying it. And so thank you so much for sharing. My question, based on what you're saying, is there a point in your practice where forgiveness and compassion for perpetrators come in? But then we also have the opposite side, which Pema Chodron calls idiot compassion. The idiot compassion, and it's a terrible phrase, I understand, but that's what it's known as. The idea that we let people continue doing what the harm they're doing out of compassion. The idea of like, oh well, we understand. It's like, no, that's harmful too. So where's the balance between understanding the perpetrator suffering, but also saying, no, that's not okay. We're going to have boundaries. So where is that for you?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Um, and, I think that the journey of mindfulness in the world, is one of kind of continuous checking in. It's
Yes.
not like you arrive at a place and you set a boundary and now you know. It's moment by moment awareness of just what's called for here. And to me, we haven't used this word trust, but I want to bring this in here. We're cultivating a kind of trustworthiness in our own inner guide.
Mhm.
And it's really that ability to trust that we can discern when and how to set a boundary or to sort of relax a boundary. That we can discern when and how to offer empathy and compassion, and when at the same time, right? Because it's not about things being this or that, but this and that and some other third or fourth thing. It's multiple complexity that we're talking about here. So yes, you can have empathy and compassion, and at the very same time say no to that behavior
Mhm.
henceforth and hold that boundary very clearly. And you can do it with joy. It's like, this person may change, may become better later, but for now, the boundary is clear. So, yeah, I think that's what we are cultivating the ability to do. That's really what mindfulness is to me. It is, it is the cultivation of the capacity to discern what's called for here and now.
Mhm.
And, it's about recognizing that reality is complex,
Mhm.
and we can have multiple dimensions in the moment, right? So we can have a sense of the possibility that somebody can be better than they are, while at the same time recognizing that what they're doing right now is harmful and must be stopped.
Mhm.
And that's an example of what for me is what we really mean by true compassion. It is
Mhm.
not about missing the need to set boundaries, hold people accountable, demand, if you will, that they do something different. Um, it is, though, about always being mindful of maybe, needing to pull back, maybe having gone too far, not being unwilling to acknowledge where we need to change course. It's about not getting stuck. It is about taking the action that we feel like is the best thing that we can do for now to minimize harm, but also being willing to pause, take stock and to begin again.
Mm. Love it. I appreciate you. You got fired up with that. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's real. No, wait,
I
this is a
know.
real question. I appreciate you for asking this very real question right now.
Yeah, this is what's most important is how we treat ourselves and how we're treating others. And we need to
Exactly.
slow down to discern what's going on for us. And when you said trust, what I also end up teaching is how can people have their own backs? We need to know we have our own backs.
Exactly. Because then we can trust another person because we
That's
know
right.
the minute they start overstepping, we're here for each other. It's like,
Yes. Right.
yeah. So, and that's where the trust in another actually comes from. It comes from trusting yourself.
I want our audience to hear that because that's such an important piece. I learned that myself. If I
Yeah.
have myself and I know I'll take care of myself, then I can
Yeah.
show another and go, hey, that doesn't work for me.
Yeah. 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 I can trust you until that moment where I need to say, the trust I have in myself
Mm-hmm.
makes it clear that what has happened, what needs to happen, how you are isn't working for me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really always that ability to trust oneself is what allows you to give room to another person because
Yeah.
you know you're going to be there for yourself. You know you're going to have your own back, such that when they do something, if they happen to do something that kind of transgresses a boundary or disrupts an important value, you're there. You're the backstop.
Yeah.
And you're not relying on them. You're not sort of giving yourself over to them and not protecting yourself in that way.
Yeah, and I think that starts by not transgressing our own boundaries. And it's a good place that mindfulness brings us to because we can see it happening and now we can make a decision to not do that to
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah. And it's not, easy necessarily to get to that place.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I think, again, love, compassion for ourselves is really important. Resisting the temptations of kind of shameful self-criticism that we haven't protected ourselves enough or we don't have our back. This is why there is no one size fits all for this. And, we do need to kind of lovingly support ourselves on the journey as we cultivate the capacity to be there for ourselves. There were times in my life when I wasn't able to be there for myself in the way that I can now. But I do think, and therefore it makes it easier for me to kind of meet someone where they are and try and offer them a vision of the possible that you can stand up for yourself. But also, this isn't about shaming and blaming, right? If you are right now needing extra support, let's just love yourself to the place where you can then be the extra support that you can be.
Mm. A beautiful message to end our discussion on. How can you hold up the book again and can you tell us where we can find you?
Yeah, there we are. So the inner work of racial justice, healing ourselves, which thank you so much, Mike. This has been a beautiful moment for us to focus in on different dimensions on that part. How do we heal ourselves? But the other part of that subtitle, and transforming our communities, right, through mindfulness. And I can be found at Rhonda V. McGee. That's MAGEE.com. And you can certainly find me offering sessions and connecting with others from there.
Thank you so much for being you and showing up for all of us to help us become the best of ourselves and transform our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for everything you're doing with this summit.
Mm.